One afternoon in 1998, a farmer in Parkersburg, West Virginia, walked down to his pasture and was shocked by what he found. The creek behind his property had turned white, the kind of white that wasn't natural. A cow stood at the edge, trembling, barely able to stand. Then suddenly, it collapsed. It never regained consciousness. Over the next few weeks, the farmer watched dozens more die, bloated and sick beyond saving. That farmer's name was Wilbur Tennant. What he didn't know was that the creek feeding his land carried waste from a nearby DuPont chemical plant. The same company making Teflon cookware and waterproof coatings had been dumping a chemical called PFOA, a compound so persistent it would later be known as a forever chemical.
What I'm about to show you here in a little bit is part of this landfill. State of West Virginia issued EI DuPont Company a permit for them to run their contaminated wastewater down through two farms here, out into this stream of water here.
Wilbur filmed everything. The carcasses, the discolored water. He sent tapes to reporters, lawyers, anyone who would listen. At first, no one did, until a lawyer from Cincinnati stepped in. But what killed Wilbur's cows wasn't new. It was the latest chapter in a story that began a century earlier when a man named Harvey Wiley gathered 12 volunteers in a Washington, D.C. basement and fed them poisoned food on purpose. They called themselves the Poison Squad, men who risked their lives to prove what the food industry wouldn't admit, that America was being slowly poisoned for profit. Then, almost 100 years later, a brave man gathered 11 CEOs to discuss the dangers their foods were causing. But when one CEO, Stephen Sanger, stood up to speak, he gave a shocking response that would seal the fate of the American diet forever. Over 20 years later, the story hasn't changed. Those same dangerous products still fill our grocery aisles, wrapped in color and comfort. But behind every Skittle, Dorito, and microwave popcorn bag hides a story of chemistry gone too far. Titanium dioxide to make colors pop, diacetyl to fake smells, dangerous preservatives to cheat time. But worse, for decades they've all been labeled safe. This is the story of how big food poisoned America. It's 1902, and in the basement of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., 12 young men sat down to dinner. They didn't know it, but they were about to become the most important guinea pigs in American history. Leading this bizarre and dangerous experiment was the chief chemist, Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, a big, jovial man with a fierce belief. He had secured a $5,000 appropriation from Congress and was basically trying to prove a point that the food on America's shelves was slowly killing people. The men involved in the experiment were paid $5 a month, but there was a catch. Every bite they took was poisoned. They would later be known as the Poison Squad. The crazy thing is, while Wiley was attempting to poison 12 men in suits and bow ties, Americans were having the time of their lives. New synthetic compounds were being cooked up, and American food companies, racing to get products on shelves quickly and cheaply, were tossing them in with reckless abandon. There were no labels, no regulations, and frankly, most Americans didn't even care. They were too thrilled by the speed and convenience of the new industrial age to worry about what was actually in their canned beans or their brightly colored candies. This was the perfect environment for toxic ingredients to evolve and flourish. However, this was something Wiley couldn't ignore, and it made perfect sense why he felt this way. He was raised on a farm, which gave him a practical knowledge of agriculture, but he combined that with an elite education that grounded him in chemistry. His first published paper in 1881 criticized one of the biggest food scandals of the time, the adulteration of sugar with cheap glucose. Manufacturers were cutting pure cane sugar with industrial glucose made from cornstarch, lowering costs but also changing the flavor and purity of nearly everything Americans ate, from syrup and candy to preserves and baked goods. This was one of Wiley's early fights for what Americans ate, though he wasn't loud about it yet. However, when he was made the chief chemist for the USDA a year later, something shifted in him and he couldn't go back again. You see, while he continued his analysis of sugar chemistry, he kept seeing terrible things done with food, such as the embalming of milk and the inclusion of untested preservatives like borax. It was then he knew he needed to do whatever it took to clean up the nation's diet. He was so determined to fight against toxic ingredients that he hired a journalist to present his findings in a way that the public and politicians could understand. But guess what? Nobody cared. Then came the scandal that proved him right. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, soldiers were fed embalmed beef, meat packed with chemicals to stop it from spoiling in the tropical heat. Troops fell severely ill, and the story exploded across the country. The same poison that sat quietly in city markets had now followed America into battle. Finally, people were starting to notice, and in 1902, Wiley got the funds to execute his most daring plan, the Poison Squad. The first chemical on the menu was borax, which food packers loved because it was used to make old, decomposing meat look fresh, tightening up the fibers and preserving it. Wiley's subjects, eating meat and dairy laced with borax, soon started experiencing headaches, stomach distress, and a loss of appetite. Then, in 1905, Wiley's Poison Squad was set to work on salicylic acid, used widely in various products, and discovered that it caused severe bleeding of the stomach. So his findings should have prompted swift action, right? Well, not exactly. The proposed 1902 food bill didn't get a single vote in Congress because the food industry was fighting back through lobbying. Even President Roosevelt, who felt Wiley might be doing too much, decided to have all his proposed banned additives retested. This is because Wiley had also come for saccharin, which the president consumed. It was then that Wiley knew he had to try a different strategy. He decided to target American women, knowing they had more influence in the kitchen. This was the deal breaker. Allies like Alice Lakey, an activist from New Jersey, organized a nationwide campaign for pure food. But it got better when over 1 million women wrote to the White House demanding action. Even big companies like Heinz joined in, replacing preservatives in their ketchup with vinegar. Then, in 1906, a novel changed everything. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the horrors of Chicago slaughterhouses. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was already haunted by the embalmed beef scandal, finally gave in. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, America's first real food law. Finally, food seemed honest again. Labels appeared, inspections began, and the worst chemicals disappeared from everyday products. This was a monumental feat, but it wasn't over yet. In fact, things were about to get worse because behind the scenes, someone was creating a new way to poison Americans. In 1957, 2 American chemists were sitting in a lab surrounded by the quiet hum of glass tubes and the faint, sweet smell of corn. Their names were Richard Marshall and Earl Cooey. But where Harvey Wiley was feeding volunteers with poisoned food, these 2 chemists had another thing in mind. They were creating something the world had never seen before, a syrup that was cheap, liquid, and just as sweet as sugar. Using an enzyme known as glucose isomerase, they rearranged the chemical structure of corn syrup to form the first high-fructose corn syrup, or HFCS. It was brilliant, except no one cared about its use or importance just yet because sugar still provided companies and families with what they wanted. But what these scientists didn't know was that that small lab experiment would soon reshape the American diet and health in a way the modern world has not been able to recover from. So while HFCS waited for its time to shine, the Second World War had given Americans a new, dangerous idea. Ammonium nitrate, the key ingredient in wartime explosives, found new life as a fertilizer. The leftover stockpiles were poured onto farmland across the Midwest, and yields exploded. Pun intended. But yeah, the land produced more food than ever before. But there was still a major problem. Food prices kept swinging up and down. Droughts overseas and inflation at home made groceries expensive, and voters were restless. So when Richard Nixon took office, he wanted cheaper food on American tables. This is where things would blow out of proportion. In 1971, Nixon consulted his Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, whose plan was to urge farmers to plant more and more crops, particularly corn and soy. Actually, it wasn't an urge, but more of an aggressive warning that Butz gave farmers. Back then, he would always say to the growers, "Get big or get out." He pushed farmers to plant fence row to fence row and promised that government subsidies would cover them if prices dropped. Therefore, corn became the king crop. The government paid the farmers, and so they produced endlessly. Corn for livestock feed, corn for oil, corn for syrup, corn, corn, corn. At first, it worked. Food got cheaper, exports boomed, but within a few years, the country was drowning in grain. Then, in the 1980s, the market crashed, forcing thousands of family farms out of business. What was meant to save American farming ended up breaking it. However, the destruction wasn't the worst part. It was what came after. This is when Richard Marshall and Earl Cooey's HFCS would get the chance to rewrite American diets. You see, corporate companies like Archer Daniels Midland or ADM swooped in, buying up cheap corn and turning it into products that would soon fill every supermarket shelf. ADM's powerful CEO, Dwayne Andreas, successfully lobbied to keep foreign cane sugar prices high through tariffs and quotas. With cane sugar artificially inflated and corn syrup artificially cheap, HFCS became the most profitable choice for any mass-produced food or beverage. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola and Pepsi also made the switch from sugar to HFCS, and the switch was made effortless by a powerful regulatory loophole: GRAS, or Generally Recognized as Safe. This was a self-regulatory designation that allowed manufacturers to introduce new additives without rigorous, long-term testing, provided a panel of industry experts deemed it safe. The logic was that if it was recognized as safe, it didn't need to be officially proven safe. HFCS was fast-tracked this way. Originally meant for everyday ingredients like vinegar or salt, the rule opened a door that would never close. Through GRAS, chemicals like titanium dioxide also slipped into the food supply. It makes candy colors pop and baked goods look brighter. It's used in toothpaste, frosting, even chewing gum. Companies didn't need to prove it was harmless, only that someone, somewhere, thought it probably was. Worse, Americans didn't care as long as the food was fast and convenient. But the result of this ignorance would begin manifesting in the most destructive and deadly ways possible. In 2007, a 59-year-old man named Wayne Watson sat across from his doctor in Denver, Colorado, trying to understand why his lungs were collapsing. He wasn't a smoker, and he didn't work in a factory. He was an ordinary man who loved microwave popcorn. Every night for years, he'd open a fresh bag, inhale the buttery steam, and watch his favorite shows. But now, breathing was a problem. He was coughing, wheezing, and had shortness of breath. When his doctor, Dr. Cecile Rose, ran tests, she found that his lungs looked like they belonged to a factory worker. They were scarred, shrunken, and irreversibly damaged.
I've lost roughly 50% of my lung capacity.
The diagnosis was shocking: bronchiolitis obliterans, or simply popcorn lung, a rare and incurable disease.
You cannot blow air out. The very small airways become blocked with scar tissue and inflammation.
The chemical ingredient responsible was called diacetyl, a compound that gives popcorn, chips, and baked goods their warm, buttery aroma. Food companies had used it for decades. It was cheap, powerful, and considered safe. That same word the FDA's GRAS system loved so much. However, inside microwave popcorn plants, workers had been coughing up blood and gasping for air for years. Some even needed lung transplants. And in 2004, one worker had been paid $20 million for lung damage by the Glister Mary Lee plant. This was the same company that manufactured the popcorn that destroyed Watson's lung forever. This was the cost of convenience for the American people. But of course, as it always went, the company and the supermarket that sold the popcorn were sued by Watson, and he would later win a $7 million award in damages. However, his story raised a question that wouldn't go away. If a chemical could kill you through smell, what about the ones we eat every day? By then, America was already deep in its love affair with toxic ingredients. Flavoring chemicals like diacetyl, preservatives like BHA and BHT, and coloring agents like Red 40 were in nearly everything. Each had passed through the GRAS loophole, rubber-stamped as safe without long-term human testing. Food scientists called it innovation, but in reality, it was an experiment and the entire country was the test group. The same decade Wayne Watson fought for his lungs, a farmer in West Virginia was fighting for his life's work. This is where the contamination truly showed its ultimate, terrifying form. Back in Parkersburg, West Virginia, the farmer we spoke about in the beginning, Wilbur Tennant, walked down to his creek and saw the nightmare that started it all. The water was milky white, and his cattle were dying in the most horrible ways possible. Wilbur's raw, painful videotapes of the carnage were the key that unlocked one of the most significant corporate contamination cases in American history.
You call this hemorrhaging disease or whatever you want to call it, but this cow died with extremely high fever. You see the discoloration in the hair here on her neck. This is 153 of these animals that I've lost on this farm.
He sent the tapes to local reporters, politicians, and lawyers, hoping someone would listen. But here's the thing, Parkersburg was basically owned by DuPont, so no one came to his rescue. It was then that he called a Cincinnati attorney named Rob Billett, who agreed to help him. Billett would later find out that a chemical, perfluoric tannoic acid, or PFOA, had been dumped into the creek by the nearby DuPont chemical plant. PFOA was a processing aid used to make industrial products like Teflon nonstick pans, stain-repellent carpets, and water-resistant clothing. But the issue was that the waste formed from their production was usually dumped recklessly in water on land. Now, for a chemical like PFOA that never breaks down, this meant that the ground, the water, and the blood of the community were now permanently contaminated. This is the most alarming development in the toxic ingredient story. The danger moved from being an intentional ingredient like HFCS to an unseen, unavoidable contaminant. And it gets even worse because PFOA and its chemical cousins didn't just stay in Teflon pans. You see, before they were phased out, they were also used extensively in the creation of grease-proof food packaging. You know, those slick interiors of burger wrappers, the liners of pizza boxes, and the non-stick coating inside the bag of microwave popcorn that killed Wayne Watson? Yup, those too. But the most sickening part was the sheer arrogance and the regulatory delay that allowed this to happen. The case of trans fats perfectly demonstrates this willful ignorance. Created to make cheap oils last longer, trans fats became a part of processed foods even after scientists in the 1980s linked them to heart disease. The FDA didn't ban them until 2015. That's about 40 years after the first warnings and countless preventable deaths. We'll dig deeper into that story in a future episode. In any case, while PFOA and trans fat have been banned, there are still multiple toxic ingredients that are in American foods today. And the craziest part is that people know about these chemicals, yet they eat the foods and become addicted. So why is this happening? Why are Americans being poisoned, and who's responsible? On the evening of April 8, 1999, a strange and tense gathering took place in the Minneapolis headquarters of Pillsbury. It was a summit of 11 men who, collectively, held the keys to America's diet. We are talking about the men who owned Nestle, Coca-Cola, Mars, executives who normally battled for what they called stomach share, or more simply, the amount of space in the customer's stomach that they can take from the competition. However, that day they came together for one purpose: to privately confront the elephant in the room, the escalating national obesity epidemic. The man who greeted them, Pillsbury executive James Banky, was anxious. He and some colleagues had spent months planning this delicate meeting, hoping to convince the CEOs that the industry had pushed things too far and that self-regulation was the only way to head off government intervention. The presentation was delivered by a Kraft vice president named Michael Mudd, and the facts were undeniable. Over half of American adults were now overweight, and the obesity rate among children had more than doubled since 1980, shooting past 12 million. Critics were blaming the food manufacturers, and Mudd pressed the point home by making a jaw-dropping comparison. He projected a quote that likened the processed food industry's marketing to children to the tactics of the tobacco industry. Mudd was urging the executives to use their vast scientific expertise to understand why Americans were overeating. Then he asked that the companies voluntarily agree to pull back on the addictive levels of salt, sugar, and fat in their products. But guess what? The plan didn't stand a chance. After Mudd concluded, the man who rose to speak effectively killed the initiative. It was Stephen Sanger, the head of General Mills, a company that had perfected the art of transformation. They had famously turned simple yogurt into a sugar-loaded dessert called Yoplait. Sanger reportedly reminded everyone present that consumers were fickle. He dismissed the idea of reforming recipes and told the other executives to do the same. And they did. The message was unmistakable. Profit and taste would always win out over public health. What's wild is that when these executives went back home, they upped their game. They continued selling not just dangerous food, but dependency. And the latter is the most dangerous thing here. Consumers keep buying what they know might kill them because they are drawn in by companies that have mastered the science of making their products irresistible to the human brain. This mastery is achieved through relentless chemical engineering to hit the precise bliss point, a term linked to food industry legend Howard Moskowitz. We have covered this detail in a previous story, but just as a reminder, when you look at a product like Prego spaghetti sauce, the largest ingredient after tomatoes is often sugar, and this gives it a sweetness far beyond what is naturally required solely to drive continued consumption. Moskowitz's research exposed the principle of sensory-specific satiety. In simple terms, this means that while big, distinct flavors eventually bore the brain and tell you to stop eating, the most successful junk food items like Coca-Cola, Doritos, or those optimized sauces are engineered to have a complex, non-distinct flavor. They pique the taste buds just enough to be alluring, yet they lack the dominant signal that would tell the brain, "I've had enough." The result is that your brain registers pleasure, but your stomach never feels satisfied, driving an endless cycle of overconsumption that is no longer about hunger, but about a chemically induced craving. The cheap, endless supply of ingredients guaranteed by the Earl Butz Farm policy provided the perfect, budget-friendly tools to carry out this high-level psychological and physiological attack. So where does that leave us? What have food regulatory bodies done to stop the growth of toxic ingredients? The system remains structurally flawed, primarily because the grass loophole is still wide open, allowing manufacturers to approve their own chemical ingredients without independent government vetting. When one chemical is banned, the industry simply introduces the next one, perpetuating the cycle. The ultimate way forward is not found in expecting the industry to change or the government to move quickly. That will never happen. So, it is up to the consumer. The pressure of the modern marketplace, the fear of financial and reputational loss, is the only force strong enough to change the formulas that Stephen Sanger defended in 1999. We see this today with titanium dioxide. Even though the FDA has yet to ban the chemical in the US, European countries have faced overwhelming consumer scrutiny. And this has led to major food companies voluntarily removing the chemical from their products. They're acting because a critical mass of informed buyers have used their purchasing power to make the ingredient a financial liability. Toxic American ingredients will only be history when people start craving real, natural food over the buzz of processed junk. Only then will companies see that our health is worth more than their profits. So, the choice and the responsibility is yours.